Welcome to Veteran State of Mind. I'm your host, Geraint Jones, and today is the last episode ever of Veteran State of Mind. But before you start crying, before you start having a tantrum, throwing your teddies at the pram, do not fear, because we will be having more podcast episodes. You don't need to subscribe to anything different. You don't need to go and find a new podcast or anything like that. It'll be coming to you on this very same channel. We're just going to have a new title and we're going to have some new content. You guys asked for more war stories, so you're going to be getting more war stories. I also want to just say as well that, I do really appreciate feedback and that kind of thing about what you guys want. If you have ideas, if you have things like that, then get in touch. But we've been doing Veteran State of Mind going on, I think, 4 years now, and we've kind of been experimenting with different things. I've had a variety of guests on, and I just think the way to go now, from what you guys have been telling me, is we'll kind of concentrate on the kind of the war stories here, and then there will be a separate platform for the other kind of stuff where we have guests from outside of that. So today's going to be the last one of Veteran State of Mind, as you knew it, and I think we've got a really kind of a well-suited guest for that. His name's Scott Horton. He's an author. He's a radio host of Antiwar.com. And before you start thinking that means Scott's kind of a pacifist, we'll talk about that inside the podcast. But what I'll tell you that Scott is, I mean, it's not listed on his things, on his kind of online bios, but I would say that the guy is an incredible historian. He knows the war on terror and a lot of the other conflicts that are going around the globe right now. Honestly, like no one else I can think of. He has everything off the top of his head. Who said what, where, when they said it, why they said it. Scott is just an absolute font of knowledge. So if you fought in the war on terror, if you're interested in the war on terror, I think you're going to really, really kind of dig today's episode, because Scott just breaks it down like nobody else can. I originally recorded this episode. I was away at the time and I tried recording from the hotel. I had a headphone malfunction. And because you guys deserve nothing but the best, I didn't want to put out the quality, the crappy quality audio. So I've come in to see Peter in the studio, where you always get these beautiful Dom Perignon kind of crystal clear sounds. So we're going to be recording my part again, right? Essentially, I'm going to re-record what I said, because Scott's audio was great, but mine, I was in a hotel, it sucked. So if something sounds a little bit kind of cut in or something like that, it's not because I've stolen one of Scott's podcasts and then put my voice over it. It's because we recorded and my end of the audio sounded crap. So done our best to kind of bring that up to scratch. Big thank you to the Patreons for supporting today's podcast. Going on, the Patreon will still be going on, and as ever, the any money from the Patreon goes to recording costs, hosting costs, all that kind of stuff. It goes to costs, basically. It doesn't go to me having hotel rooms, unfortunately. Maybe one day. So, guys, without further ado, here we go. Last episode of Veteran State of Mind, but not the last podcast episode. So please give a very warm welcome to the great Scott Horton. How did you get involved in the antiwar.com movement?
I've always been an anti-government guy, really just, ever since I was a kid. So I think about my influences, but I was collecting them deliberately, all of my kind of anti-government stuff. And then it was, I guess I was, 24, 25 when the war on terrorism broke out. But I've been predicting it for years. I mean, it was so obvious in the late 90s that the war on terrorism is next, is this huge project that they're going to get underway. And I was much more of a conspiracist then. I was younger and I was much more willing to speculate. And I concluded that, they're going to let there be a giant attack. They're going to let one through so they can start the war. And then, not to get too far into that, but when September 11th finally did happen, the people who agreed with me on that went so far off the deep end that it probably, repelled me the other way. And I learned, much more about Al Qaeda and, yes, the degree to which the U.S. and the Saudis and the Brits backed them and supported them, but also the degree of their independence and their motive for attacking the United States, their strategy for attacking the United States. And then see, at the same time that sort of the conspiracists were going on about the missile that hit the Pentagon and trying to frame it up like Dick Cheney did it, the neoconservatives who worked for Dick Cheney, they were doing the exact same thing, cherry picking all of their evidence to try to make it look like Saddam Hussein did it. And to a guy like me, that was the most transparent thing in the world. To a lot of people, it was, who already knew better than that. They're like, this guy's got the mustache, that guy's got the beard, and they're very different, But anyway, so what happened was I was palling around with the guys from Antiwar.com and reading especially Justin Raimondo. And he was familiar with all of like kind of the older and obsolete John Birch type conspiracy stuff that I was into. Tragedy and Hope and the Council on Foreign Relations and the One World Government and all that. He knew about all that, but he just knew better than all that than to think that that's what's going on here. And he was just so much smarter and so much more informed. His column was called Behind the Headlines, and it really was that. And when I started really reading him regularly in 2002, I guess it was really, like after September 11th, but in the run up to the Iraq War was when I really started reading him regularly. And I just threw in with antiwar.com, like they're right-leaning libertarians, Ron Paul libertarians, constitutionalists, old republic guys who hate war and know better, right? Like they're not like, oh man, give peace a chance. They're like, let me tell you all about the career of the Israeli spy Richard Perle, the current head of the Defense Policy Board and ringleader of the conspiracy to lie us into war with Iraq and what all is really going on here. And it was like, this is some deep stuff. And it wasn't conspiracy crankery. It was really good journalism, man. It was really important. And so I just, antiwar.com is essentially, it's their project, Justin and Eric Garris. And I just more or less threw in with them. And I had always been a right-wing radio junkie, AM radio junkie.
So right-wing has certain kind of connotations in the UK. So we just want to clarify that is right of centre, not right-wing as people know it from a kind of fascistic point of view. We have pirate radio stations in the UK, but usually, from what I know, they're usually used for drum and bass rather than politics. But it's kind of interesting because they are like a forerunner for podcasts. And when it comes to podcasts, like you are the Obi-Wan, you're like, what, up to like 6,000 podcasts by now?
That's an important point. I don't mean that far to the right. In America, especially in the 1990s, there was a huge phenomenon of Republican Party aligned conservative radio. So by right, I just mean to the right of the left. I don't mean all the way to the National Socialists and all of that.
We have a lot of grunts listening, so we have to make sure, because they're like, oh, I like these Scott Horton guys, got some great ideas.
Not that far right. Yes, the phenomenon was basically Rush Limbaugh, who was a spokesman for the Republican Party, basically, and his clones, of which there were 10 million of them on AM radio in the 90s. And I just love the format of anybody with a phone can get in on this thing. This is before the internet was really widespread it was certainly before social media and all these things really gave everyone a voice. And it was really like, the three main TV channels tell you what to think about everything. Them and the New York Times tell you what to think about everything. And then here on radio, anybody with a phone can call in, and any author of any wild book that didn't get reviewed in the New York Times can get a spot to be interviewed on the radio and have a conversation. And where, that was, to me, real alternative media, the real town square of regular people doing our own communicating without just being, served up our talking points by Tom Brokaw and Dan Rather and Peter Jennings, who were the TV news, nightly news stars at that time, who forged the consensus at that time. So I started doing pirate radio in 98 through 2000, and then the FCC seized that station. And then we put up another one that was free radio also. And then I shouldn't say my good friends, but I didn't really have a hand in building it, put up Chaos Radio, 95.9 FM, which is another pirate radio station in South Austin. And I believe we went on the air at the end of 01, maybe the beginning of 02. And so I had a show on there that was called We Cuss on Here?
Right. Yes, you can even say the C word.
The way shit is, the best I can tell. And then, but I started an interview show in April of 03. And then, what happened was I had a friend who was like, dude, I will give you a computer if you would just use it. For God's sake, man. And then I had another friend who was like, dude, I'll build you a website. And so once I started doing the interviews, I started posting them online. And they were originally at philipdrew.com. So that's the same archive that you can find now. So I was one of the original podcasters. You know, I think Adam Curry said that he was way before that, but I was one of the first guys to post all my MP3s and my interviews online, and they're all still there. And in fact, YouTube fetched up in the margin one day, old long lost, my first interview that I ever did with a surviving Branch Davidian from 1999. And that's now in the archive as well.
Can you just explain to the British audience who the Branch Davidians are?
Oh, so people might remember David Koresh. TV said that he called himself Jesus, and they lived in a giant plywood mansion, if you could call it that. They called it the Compound, and it was a religious sect, break off of the Seventh-day Adventists, and the FBI trumped up a gun charge against them so they could do a spectacular raid on TV and get funding for their government program. But they shot first and started a firefight, and the Davidians.
So, you know, obviously, like in 2000, you know, we saw someone die at the hands of an employee of the state, you know, with the George Floyd killings. Yep. There was a the BLM movement there, mass protests all around the globe for someone that had been kind of, you know, killed by an employee of the state, you know, a police officer. And I found really interesting about that video. I mean, it was a shocking video, but there was something interesting about it, is that people around them were filming and knew that the man was dying, and they were shouting at them to let him up, but not one person kind of intervened. And that's kind of understandable, because they all knew that if they did intervene, then they could either, you know, in an like not totally unlikely, but possibly be on the end of deadly force. But certainly, if they came and like threw a police officer to the ground, you know, their lives could be ruined.
Yeah, like picture that situation where if someone on that sidewalk had, with their hands open, like clearly unarmed, just run over there to try to push the cop off the guy, something like that. They probably would have shot him, and they definitely would have put him in prison.
I do hate the term conspiracy theory. I know a lot of reasons why. I feel like it almost at this point undermines, you know, I used it, the Guy Fawkes one, because it's kind of is like a bit of a tongue-in-cheek one, but generally speaking, like a lot of conspiracy theories are not conspiracy theories. It's quite often the usual barefaced truth, but then they kind of use the term conspiracy theory to devalue it. And do you find that like people who are like, say, 9/11 truthers and that kind of thing, do they actually hurt like the anti-war effort?
In a way, you know, it's a double-edged sword, because you could also say that like that's the kind of goofy stuff that gets people interested in, you know, deep politics, that everything's not what it seems. There's something else going on, you know, and whatever in power. So sometimes people start out as kooks and then they kind of grow out of it. I mean, it's true, first of all, that the term itself evidently was coined by the CIA to discredit people who thought that they had killed Jack Kennedy by saying, oh, that's a conspiracy theory. In other words, you know, it was made to debunk honest inquiry, right? At the same time, though, like there definitely is such a thing as jumping to conclusions. And there are people who are interested in the real story behind what's going on in politics, which so much of it is secret. And so much of it is never revealed, right? That people do quite legitimately theorize and, you know, come up with hypotheses and things for like, well, what is the real explanation for this? And a lot of times people are too quick to jump to conclusions. They're satisfied that, well, look who benefits from this, so they must be the ones who did it. When actually, well, geez, there's a lot of different people who benefit from X activity, you know, whatever it is. And a lot of times, no matter what is the crisis, the government's going to take advantage of it anyway, right? So they didn't have to cause Hurricane Katrina to then say, hey, let's see if we can get away with stealing guns from people, going door to door and taking guns. It'll be like a little test case for that. You know, they didn't cause the storm, but they just said, hey, here's a crisis. Let's try gun confiscation, you know, and whatever it is. And this is why libertarian economics are so important. So people understand the economics of bureaucracy, because government is a monopoly, an illegal one, and with guns to enforce its monopoly. You can't fire them and replace them. So the more they fail, the better they do. The worse job they do, the more money they get to keep failing at the same job. And so it's in their interest to make kids stupid at school. It's in their interest to get attacked by terrorists. It's in their interest to have, whatever fallen infrastructure, to have, pockets of extreme poverty and crime and all of these things. Those are all good for government. Anyway, I'm off on a tangent, but the point that I'm trying to make is that, yes, power corrupts and power is corrupt. And it's the job of adults out here in the country, us non-government employees, to try our best to figure out what they're up to and how best to stop them, how best to expose them and undermine faith in their authority and all of that. But it's also true that a lot of times the more kooky factions will, end up muddying the water on some things and make matters worse. I think 9/11 is probably the best example of that. Where, by the way, if the CIA coined the name conspiracy theorists, it was the 9/11 kooks themselves who named themselves the truthers. I mean, if that doesn't tell you that they have no wisdom at all, just on the right at the beginning, hey, let's call ourselves the truthers. That'll look great. Everyone will think that we know the truth better than them if we call ourselves that. And then they're off on a million tangents of just total nonsense. Like Donald Rumsfeld shot a missile at the Pentagon while he was sitting in the son of a bitch. And, there's a bomb on every column, on every floor of 3 towers in downtown Manhattan in broad daylight, even though sure doesn't look like a bunch of bombs going off, but whatever, you just say that anyway. And all of this just red herrings, all these tangents that what do they really do? I mean, let's just say, like, hypothetically, there just was no such thing as conspiracy nuts. Like, just regular people didn't ask these kinds of questions. And the only people in the world who would ask anything like these questions about what really happened there would just be journalists, even like pretty mainstream ones or somewhat alternative ones or whatever. Well, some of them, I think, would have really gotten on the scent of the degree to which Saudi intelligence and CIA had infiltrated this group, or at least had attempted to infiltrate this group, and the extent to which, if they had been working with the FBI to stop the plot, that they sure could have. The extent to which, and the question of whether possibly some people in the government did have a real interest in turning a blind eye and allowing the thing to happen. Not just that they had tried to infiltrate them to turn some double agents and failed, but that they had deliberately wanted the attack to happen. We don't know that. Like, that's the ultimate answer of the truthers, but they just skip to the end. They just go, oh yeah, well, you can tell it's a total conspiracy, and then went to go and cherry pick, just like the neocons trying to implicate Saddam Hussein. They went and cherry picked every little thing to make it seem like they were right. Like, look, there's not wreckage of a plane all over the front lawn of the Pentagon. Yeah, well, that's because it hit the building. It didn't crash on the front lawn, stupid. But so meanwhile, any like Seymour Hersh type journalist who might have been really interested in nailing down just what all exactly did Prince Turki Al Faisal and Prince Bandar bin Sultan and George Tenet and Cofer Black and Rich Blee and all the guys at the Alex Station and the Counterterrorism Center at CIA. What all did they know about these guys? I mean, we know, even this is the official story in the commission report, is that at least 2 of these guys, the guys that crashed the plane into the Pentagon, they'd been in the country for a year and a half. And the CIA had followed them from the Malaysia meeting where they agreed, yeah, let's do the planes operation, to Bangkok, Thailand, straight to LAX, where they'd been living with a Saudi informant and an FBI informant the whole time there. And clearly now it's clear that the CIA and Saudis were trying to infiltrate and control these guys. The question is whether they did or not. It looks, obviously, the Occam's razor thing is that they tried and failed to flip them. And then instead of wrapping them up and getting them out of the country, they lost them. And instead of telling the FBI immediately, you better find these guys on red alert and wrap their asses up, they didn't. And then they got away with attacking us anyway. But anyway, so this, at the very least, that's 3,000 counts of criminally negligent homicide, right? At the very least, you take the head of the FBI, or all the deputy directors. That the director was brand new, but you take all of the top managers of the FBI and the CIA, and you put them all up on the gallows with a rope around their neck, and you start poking them in the side with a spear and yell at them, "Squeal, boy, squeal," and see if you can get them to rat on each other. That, like, look, you know what I mean? Like, if you want accountability, if you're going to do an enhanced interrogation of anyone, it should be Prince Bandar bin Sultan. How in the world did this happen on his watch? On Prince Turkey's watch, on George Tenet's watch. Tenet had been there, remember? He was a holdover from Clinton. That was always the question. The question was never a missile hit the Pentagon and bombs in the towers and all of that crap. So what do? They just muddied the water with stupidity. I mean, if you watch that Loose Change, there's 4 different versions of that film. And none of them are talking about anything except the day the attack happened. They got the date right. And all 4 versions of the film contradict themselves about everything, and they're still wrong about everything. They still don't get any single goddamn thing right. But they took, for 10 years, they dominated the entire discussion of what really happened that day in such a way that anyone who had any intelligence and any real skill as a journalist wanting to look into it didn't bother.
You would have been taking your life into your own to kind of go against anything to look into the reasons, like, okay, well, why did this happen? Well, they hate us for our freedom. Obvious. It's actors. I mean, it must have been very difficult. I mean, I'm sure you at the time probably experienced some of this. I'll be honest with you, mate. I like to say I'm in my 30s. I've got about another 2 months left of this, so I will keep saying it as much as possible. I'm in my 30s. There was a time when I would have seen something like Antiwar.com. I would have been like, because there is a lot of power names, I would be like, fucking hippies.
When my friend Shauna showed it to me, she goes, "Hey, look at this site, antiwar.com." And I go, "Oh, what's that? A bunch of socialist crap?" And she goes, No, check it out. They run Ron Paul. And I'm like, wow. And then, by the way, if you're in your 30s, that means you were a kid when September 11th happened.
So I was just in the army. I was 17.
Certainly were a kid in the entire, during all of the antecedents leading up to the thing. I was already 25, and I already knew that, one, I suspected that they probably had let it happen anyway. I believe that less now than I did then, but that was what I believed then. But I also understood that even if, just pretend that bin Laden himself was CIA somehow, all of the guys that he tricked into getting on the airplanes and doing the deed, they weren't. Like, you're right, they weren't willing to die for a false flag operation for America. They had to be told something. They were told that America sponsors Israel when they murder little kids in Palestine and Lebanon. That America has bases in Saudi Arabia that we use to bomb and blockade and starve the people of Iraq for 10 years and support all the kings and dictators of the region and, all their degenerate anti-Islamic monarchies in the Gulf and all of that. And so that's why to get on the plane and crash into their towers. I remember at the time, in fact, listening to talk radio. I remember where I was driving down the freeway listening to this. And on right-wing radio, conservative radio. I don't mean Hitler radio. The guy is going off and he's going, the media is not being honest about what's really the motive of these terrorists. And they're lying and they're saying that they hate our freedom. And that's not true. And as long as they don't tell the truth about the real motive for the attack, then we'll never understand, how to grapple with the problem. And we're just going to end up in a worse situation. And I'm listening to this going, great, this is great. And then the guy goes, the truth is that Muhammad is Satan. And that it's an evil plot by the devil against us beautiful and wonderful and innocent Christians and Jews of the West, and we have to stop them. And that was the level of discourse at the time. No one could admit that, wait a minute, Bill Clinton, the low-down, rotten, lying, degenerate, rapist, Waco burning scumbag, was the president for the last 8 years. Maybe he did something to make these Arabs angry.
Guys, we've got Alex here from Combat Fuel, long-time sponsor of the podcast, here to talk about one of the favourite products that Combat Fuel do. I've been using it myself in my writing. Absolutely love it. Optimize. Alex, what can you tell us about it?
Absolutely. It's one of our most innovative products that we've ever released. It is phenomenal. So it was primarily designed as a gaming product, actually. And what we did with it is we turned around. We've got very, very mild stimulants in there, but massive nootropics in there. And what it does, it gives you an 8-hour high. And by a high, I don't mean anything too crazy, but it allows you to stay focused, dialed in, alert, driven to want to work or compete in jiu-jitsu, to be writing books, to do absolutely anything. It is fantastic. There's no crash. You can have it later on in the day. You're still going to sleep because of the way we formulated the product. It is absolutely insane.
Yeah, love it. Mate, thanks for that. All right, let's get back to the podcast.
After September 11th, man, it was like every sin in American history was erased. Nuking Japan, Vietnam, whatever. Nobody cared about that anymore. The spirit of the whole planet was, 7 billion people were weeping for us and on our side. And for some scum to hijack a civilian airliner full of women and children and crash it into an office tower full of office workers, civilians, and slaughtering them by the thousands. The whole world was, and the population, in Tehran, Iran, on September the 12th, they held a 1 million-man candlelight vigil and said, and the Ayatollah encouraged it, of course. Like, this is, for everyone who had beef with America, this was a chance for them to make up with us. Oh, man, something terrible happened to you? Hey, what can we do to help you? Vladimir Putin was the first person to call W. Bush. So you want to invade Afghanistan? You can use my bases in Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan to do it, dude. You just got it right. Then even when they went to Afghanistan and they took out the Taliban instead of Al-Qaeda, people were still like, whatever, dude. And everybody hated the Taliban anyway, and nobody cares about Afghanistan anyway. But man, when they went to Iraq, that was the thing. And at the time, the liars, they said, oh, they're just making you safer. There's a threat from Iraq. They're making you safer. And then the polls would say, do you feel safer? Right? It wasn't like, have you thought about it? Do you know anything about it? It was like, do you feel safer? And that's what people say. Yes, I feel safer because we attacked Iraq. And then it was like, no, look. Immediately within the first year, it was so clear that you have an entire new generation of bin Ladenite fighters who are traveling from all across the Middle East to go to Iraq just to fight us. In 2005, in fact, even 2004, I believe the CIA National Intelligence Estimate said, oh man, our Al-Qaeda problem has just increased by 1,000%. And then in 2005, there were Saudi and Israeli studies that said that 100% of the fighters in Iraq, the foreign fighters who traveled to Iraq to fight, Syrians, Jordanians, Egyptians, Libyans, and Saudis, and everyone who'd gone to Iraq to fight more or less under the rubric of Al-Qaeda in Iraq against U.S. forces there. All of them were young kids, teenagers and 20-somethings and 30-somethings, none of whom were veterans of the old war in Afghanistan. And the only role that the old Afghan war vets had played, the older generation of Al-Qaeda had played, was just coordinating it, recruitment, and sending the guys off to fight. It was a whole new generation of tens of thousands of new jihadists that they created by invading Iraq. And then, of course, as we saw, those terrorists then left there, went home to Libya, where Obama took their side, and to Syria, where Obama took their side, and in fighting those two horrible, dirty wars of the 2000 teens there.
The same people we fought in Iraq, we then armed in Syria and Libya, it's in their kind of new incarnations after, after fighting against US troops, they're then fighting against Assad. And now because Assad's now public enemy number one, now we go and arm them. And if anyone wants more depth on this kind of thing, go and check out antiwar.com. Go look through the archives on this kind of stuff for more detail, because that is an entire podcast in itself. We find it so hard to see things from the point of view of, what motivates, the other side.
Right.
And after 9/11, I thought that the only thing to do was to go into Afghanistan. And I was under the impression that it was relatively clean. You know, you've got special forces teams in there, and I thought, you know, they're taking out some bad guys here and bad guys there. But, you know, I've seen reports now that in the first few months of that war, as many civilians died, Afghan civilians, innocent civilians, as many of them died in the first few months of the war as died in 9/11. And that, you know, it starts to make you think like, well, you know, well, no wonder then there was no shortage of people that wanted to fight against us, because what drives them then is exactly the same as what was driving us.
Sure. And look, man, the thing is the premise of your conclusion there is false. They had no choice but to attack because it was the only way to get their hands on the guilty. But that's not true. The Taliban were willing to negotiate. George W. Bush said, I will not negotiate. The answer is hand them over. No conditions. We'll turn them over to any Muslim country, which of course could have been Jordan, where they would have landed on the tarmac and then taken off for the United States again in 10 minutes, right? The extradition papers signed, and that would have been done. Nope, can't do that. They said, okay, well, we'll turn them over to Pakistan. Again, Pakistan would have turned them over to us immediately. And the Pakistanis, I believe, although I can't prove, but I believe at American insistence, refused that deal.
I just brought that up because that's true. That is true.
So I heard a story about bin Laden being out hawking and the Taliban tried to hand him over to the US.
No, that was before.
That was before.
They tried to serve him up to be assassinated before September 11th numerous times. Oh, he's out falconing. We don't know where he is. He's outside of our protection until at least dinner time. Like, and then the Americans would go, hand him over, towelhead. I'm like, dude, that's what they were just doing, right? They were just, you kill him and it won't be our fault if you do it when he's out in the countryside. We told him to stay home. He goes out to the countryside and the Americans kill him. Well, hey, those are the breaks. And the Americans are like, not good enough. And you can read that in the Washington Post, man. The source for that is Milton Bearden, who ran the Operation Cyclone in the 80s. He was the station chief in Pakistan and ran that damn war in the 80s. Milton Bearden. And he was the source for that, talking about the negotiations in the 1990s. But then after September 11th, by the time they started bombing on October the 8th, they said, look, we'll turn them over to any third country in the world, which could have been Mexico or Canada, right? Anybody but Israel or the United States. They didn't even mention Israel. But we'll turn them over to any third country, and you don't need to give us proof that he did it. We're dropping that condition. We don't need to see any evidence. Just promise us you'll give him a trial somewhere. We'll turn him over to any third country in the world, which, by the way, again, any third country in the world at that time, including Iran, would have turned him over to the United States, right? Any country in the world would have immediately handed his ad, and not just him, but Zawahiri and the whole group of them. And look, get real. The only real way that they were going to do it, other than pouring the entire 82nd Airborne into Tora Bora, which they refused to do, was to have the Taliban do it. And they refused to do that. And so look, and then at Tora Bora, okay, so Tora Bora is essentially a small group of mountains in the White Mountains. It's the name of a place in the White Mountains in Nangarhar province in far eastern Afghanistan. And in fact, it's a bit of Nangarhar that actually sticks into Pakistan, the jagged line on the map there. And this had been known as the Lion's Den, where the Arab Afghan fighters had their hideout back in the 80s. And it had been like, for example, when CNN and ABC News and The Independent went and interviewed bin Laden in the 1990s, Al-Quds al-Arabi as well. That was where they met him, was at the Lion's Den there in Nangarhar. So in other words, the Americans should have immediately poured the 82nd Airborne into there, right? But instead, they took their lazy ass time. They sent the CIA and the Delta Force, and then notoriously they refused to commit the reinforcements that CIA and Delta were begging for in order to wrap the guys up. And they had Green Berets from the Alabama National Guard who were like, these guys, just tell them it's a deer and tell them go hunt that SOB, and they're going to go and find him and put a bullet in him. Nope, they're forbidden from participating whatsoever. Got Green Berets from these different A teams up in fighting in Mazar-e Sharif, fighting against the Taliban way up in northern Afghanistan, fighting against the Taliban who had tried to warn us about the attack, who were, essentially stuck with bin Laden, but were not co-conspirators in his war against us. And meanwhile, they're getting away. And you had, Rangers, thousands of Rangers at Bagram Air Base. You had the 75th Airborne Rangers, who are, I guess, second tier.
I think class was tier 2, kind of like special forces support group kind of thing.
And they're all way down in Kandahar fighting against the Taliban. And while Al-Qaeda's getting away, you got bin Laden and Zawahiri. There's footage. I don't know if you can still find this on YouTube. There's footage of bin Laden and Zawahiri sitting on a log, and Zawahiri's doing all the talking. It's someone, bin Laden, it's like his arm looks all kind of limp in his lap. He doesn't move it. Anyway, Zawahiri's doing all the talking, and he's going, ha ha, we got away. You guys had us cornered in 1 square mile, but you're such cowards. You wouldn't come and take the fight to us, dude. You had us outgunned, outnumbered, everything, and you let us get away purely because of your cowardice, which was true. Like the Delta Force would withdraw every night. They'd get up there, they get close, and they had their auxiliaries, were stabbing them in the back. Local Afghan militias that they had hired were stabbing them in the back. And they go and they get up there and they get close to the Al-Qaeda guys every night. And then the sun would go down and they go back down to base camp again. They weren't willing to risk losing a single guy. They're willing to lose 7,000 fighting a completely unnecessary terror war all across the region. And they're willing to kill, ultimately millions of people in these wars. But they weren't willing to commit the force it took to kill only combatants hiding out in their mountain redoubt there in Tora Bora. And then I only learned this much later. They called off all air assault on December the 8th. Bin Laden didn't get away till the 17th. 9 days later, bin Laden and Zawahiri got away. And I believe that was a deliberate plan. Now, I've been told by a guy, actually, I know a guy who was, I don't know exactly his position, but he was some kind of consultant to the Green Berets at that time. And what he told me was, no, man, it wasn't that Bush and Cheney and Rumsfeld said, let him get away. That's not what it was. What it was big army came. And originally it was CIA and special operations forces. But once big army finally got there, it's like creating an entire new government itself. And nobody does anything until super slow motion is done playing itself out in the setup of the thing, whatever. So that's, I respect the guy that told me that. But if you look at how it played out, especially them calling off the airstrikes and refusing to allow these guys to call in the airstrikes. And by the way, so Gary Bernson wrote the book Jawbreaker, and a guy named Thomas Greer, a.k.a. Dalton Fury, was his pseudonym. So that's the CIA commander and the Delta Force commander on the ground. And both of them say 100 times, we just couldn't understand it. We begged and we begged and we tried to figure out and we tried to understand and we asked them for reinforcements and we would say, why can't we have reinforcements? And then they would give us these reasons that didn't make any sense at all. Like they called in, we wanted them to send in Delta Team A to back up Delta Team B. And they said, no, we don't want to do that because we want to lay low and not do anything for a few days. And we want to trick Al-Qaeda into thinking we've left. Send in Team A. That'll ruin our whole lie there. Like, why do you want to do that? Why don't you want to take the fight to them until they're dead? These are the guys that just killed 3,000 of our civilian population. Our most important city. And you're letting them, you want to deceive them by not calling in the rest of Delta to blow their asses to bits? What the hell? Yeah, look, I mean, this is the story Greer tells. Greer, he does everything but accuse them of deliberately doing this, right? But he goes, look, he's a lieutenant colonel. He goes, the way it works is we are given a mission and we are never, ever decline permission to carry out that mission the way that we see fit. And they don't, according to him, they don't go off and ask for permission to do crazy things, only what they need to do. But he said they are always, anytime and always given ultimate leeway to make every tactical decision, an operational decision that they make to carry out their task. Not this time. This time they're told, no matter what it is. They want to drop landmines here. Nope. We want to take Chinook helicopters over the mountains and into Pakistan and approach them and corner them from the east. Then they'll be trapped. Nope. We want to bring in horsemen. We want to bring in the Green Berets. We want to bring in the Alabama National Guard, red-bearded, throat-slitting killers. So, it's pretty obvious to me what was going on there was, and in fact, I remember at the time, my same friend, Shauna, who pointed me to antiwar.com, she said, oh, they're going to let him go. And I was like, no way, they're going to make such an example out of him and how great our satellites are that, like, look, good luck being a 6.5-foot Arab in Afghanistan after attacking us. We're going to blow you up, dude. And she was like, nope, no, they're not either. They're going to let him go like Emmanuel Goldstein in 1984 to be the permanent enemy, scary enemy out there to hang over all our heads and justify all their wars. I mean, she must have called that on September 13th, man.
So, like Frank Ledwidge, he kind of explained that we carried on fighting these wars, but we're trying to limit the number of friendly casualties we took, in order to say, okay, we're keeping the war going, but we're not losing so many people that the public kind of demand an end to it. So I can kind of accept that limiting deaths at Tora Bora would have been potentially, a reason behind that. But, my gut feeling is just that something doesn't feel right about it. I mean, Sun Tzu has the old thing of, you build your enemy a golden bridge. And the idea for that is, if you give an army the chance to leave a battlefield so you don't have to fight them that day because maybe you can find more advantageous position, or maybe the army will just kind of start fighting amongst itself and all that kind of thing. But that doesn't really seem to be the case in Afghanistan. It really kind of feels that, you're looking at it and you can't really come up with a good reason. Like the only reason that makes sense for allowing him to get away is to continue the war.
I think, Gareth Porter makes the great point that he thinks this is the key to 9/11. It isn't that it was an inside job and they turned a blind eye deliberately because they wanted the attack to happen. What it was the neocons. Every time the CIA, and there are a lot of anecdotes about this, that the CIA, at least on some level, really were worried about this. Were trying to stop the attack. They knew there was going to be something. They weren't exactly sure when and where and what, but they were really upset. But then the neocons, and of course, Donald Rumsfeld, the Secretary of Defense, with the neocons, especially led by Paul Wolfowitz and Richard Pearl in his right ear, they were saying, no, don't listen to the CIA. This bin Laden guy is small potatoes. What's he going to do? Set off a truck bomb at an embassy overseas somewhere? Who cares about that? Don't take your eye off the ball, Mr. President. What's important is Saddam Hussein in Baghdad. So they didn't look at Al-Qaeda as a convenient excuse to go to war. Oh, I know. We'll just have a terrorist attack and then we'll pretend that Saddam is friends with Osama and then we'll go to Baghdad. No. It was, oh man, if the CIA convinces the president to get us bogged down fighting this bin Laden character in Afghanistan, we're never going to get to Baghdad. They're going to screw us out of our war in Iraq. They would say, pipe down about that. It's not about that. It's all about Saddam Hussein. And there are a lot of anecdotes kind of along those lines as well, too, from the spring and the summer of 2001.
I mean, we have so much, hubris in the West about, we just look at the enemy. People will say, well, if you haven't got, I'm not going to name names, but someone says, if you haven't got F-15s and whatever, then you can't take on the US government. And it's kind of like such hubris because, the enemy is resourceful. They have intelligent people thinking about these things. I'm not saying that they're good people, but that doesn't mean that they can't be intelligent. It's just, what happened on 9/11 was an absolute atrocity. But as far as, strategy and tactics go, it was a masterstroke and, one that was either unforeseen or that hadn't been properly planned against.
Bin Laden had declared war on the United States in 1996. And even though they blamed the Khobar Towers on Iran, that was really him. He got the blame for, I believe correctly, for the Africa embassies in 98 and the USS Cole in 2000. People were familiar that, this guy, and there was the Millennium Plot against LAX that got busted in at New Year's 2000.
I should really have asked you about this at the beginning, really. So apologies about that. But, a lot of people will probably equate anti-war with pacifism. I hate to use the term good war quote unquote. But in your mind, is that a justified time to be at war?
Look, if France attacks Britain across the channel, you guys got to do what you got to do, right? But that's not what we're talking about, right? I mean, what's happened here is that America inherited all the world empires at the end of World War II, the British and German and French and Dutch and Japanese empires for that matter. And the commies got the Soviet Union and China and then North Korea and Vietnam. But we got the rest of the world. And then when the Soviet Union fell apart, we'd already made friends with China 50 years ago. Soviet Union fell apart 30 years ago. And then instead of coming home, America decided, much like in the history of the British Empire, that this is all for everybody's own good except ours. And the only reason we're colonizing you is so that we can teach you to elect good men and wear black robes when you have an independent judiciary and your parliamentary democracy there that we're building for you because we love you so much. And we're spreading stability by extending our security umbrella to include more and more and more countries all the time, because everybody knows nobody's going to mess with a friend of the United States. And so the more we spread our power and influence, the more everything is fine. We spread international globalization of market capitalism. We insist on regular elections and civilian supremacy over the military. And we, help to prevent countries, say, for example, within the EU and within NATO from fighting with each other because they're part of the American-dominated order, and we insist that they don't, right? But then look, we're pointing this whole thing that we created is a spear pointed right at Russia's throat. Since they didn't include Russia in it from the beginning, Russia's without it. And the whole thing is obviously deemed by them to be an instrument for use against them, which, the last year and a half is exactly what it's being used for. It's to fight a proxy war with them right on their border. So, the reality is that rather than a situation where, we have kind of these rogue nations around the world that are starting wars, and then America and our allies are going and stopping them, we're the ones starting them, right? I mean, even Iraq War I, where Iraq invaded Kuwait across this international border and seized it, which is highly illegal according to the UN Charter that Iraq had signed on to and so forth. George Bush told them to do it. James Baker told them, go ahead, man. We'll see if we care if you occupy northern Iraq. And then they went, oh, geez, we didn't think he's going to take the whole country and embarrass us. So even that one was American, somewhat instigated in the first place, or just to say it supported both sides in the Iran-Iraq war before that. And then, I mean, what can you say about Bosnia, Kosovo? And then we already went down the list of the terror wars where even Afghanistan ain't good enough excuse. Certainly not Iraq, Somalia, Libya, Syria, Yemen, any of what the rest of they've done this whole time. So, but yes, I mean, look, if the Mexican army tries to retake San Antonio, then no, we're going to shoot them, dude. You can't have...
So I'm sorry to interrupt you, man, but you're a libertarian. Property rights is that important?
Ultimately, man, I don't believe in the nation state, right? I'm an anarcho-capitalist. I believe in only property rights and only property lines. But I'm also realistic that we live in a world of nation states, and you're asking me whether interstate warfare is ever justifiable. And the answer is yeah. If somebody attacks you and you have to defend yourself, fine. But just the same as if you're being mugged, proportional self-defense, right? If a guy is threatening you with deadly force, and you can use deadly force back on him. But if a guy's just swinging a punch, maybe blowing him away isn't justifiable in response.
Before we wrap up, I just want to say you have become a hero of mine over the last few years. The work that you're doing, it's just so well put together, and you're fully deserving of the title of The Great Scott Horton, which is usually a title that you have to earn through conquering an empire. So congratulations on that one.
Defend the God.
Yeah, so this is, I think, the most important political movement going on in the country right now is the Defend the Guard movement. It's all right-leaning libertarians and Republicans, and they're all combat veterans of the Iraq and Afghan wars from this era. And it's bringourtroopshome.us is the group behind it. And the movement is called Defend the Guard. And what it is it's a law that says that the 50 state governors would be forbidden from giving their National Guard soldiers to the president for use in foreign combat without an official declaration of war from the Congress, which means never, because Congress won't take responsibility for that anymore. So we haven't gotten past it yet, but we got a huge movement growing and pushing behind it and already generating some pretty severe pushback against us too, because they know how effective it is. And it's great public relations for showing just the opposite, as you suggested there. Anti-war does not mean a bunch of hippies and pacifists and liberals and socialists. I mean, these guys, again, are right-leaning veterans of the terror wars. They look just like you, man. So G.I. Joe box.
Right.
Legitimate warriors, but now smart ones who know better. They've not moved left. They just learn more about what's really going on around here. And they do such a great job. And so it's bringourtroopshome.us and defendtheguard.us. And especially for combat veterans, anti-war veterans, you guys are looking for something to do. This is a mission to go on. And with these guys, once you meet and understand who they are, Dan McKnight and Diego Rivera and the group there, and they're just the best bunch of guys. So it's definitely something to get involved in for people who have been to war and back and now want to help with that and know better. And then my only other recommendation is you just got to read my guys every day, man. I'm working on this book right now, so I'm not doing too much writing, but at antiwar.com and at libertarianinstitute.org, we got all of the best stuff, all of the best writers on, especially foreign policy, but all kinds of stuff too. Obviously antiwar.com is all foreign policy, but at the Institute, we are a little broader than that. We also got a lot of great foreign policy guys. So Dave DeCamp and Jason Ditz at antiwar.com. And then at the Institute, Kyle Anzalone, Connor Freeman and Will Porter. And then we also have Jim Bovard and Ted Galen Carpenter and Lori Calhoun and Keith Knight and all these great writers and podcasters, Tommy Salmons, Patrick McFarlane. So I'm really proud of everything going on at both of those great sites as well. And that's about it for me. As you said, I got those books and the audio books. You want my take on the terror war? It's enough already. Time to end the war on terrorism. And I'm working on Provoked, how America started the new Cold War with Russia and the catastrophe in Ukraine. And that'll be done by the end of the year.